On May 6, 2014, Monaco's richest woman, Hélène Pastor, left a hospital in Nice after visiting her son, and minutes later, her car was attacked in broad daylight. She was 77, a real estate empress worth billions, and the architect of a family system where each child reportedly received 500,000 euros every month, enough to buy anything except independence. 28 years of family dinners had already trained one man to see the real inheritance gatekeeper. When does a mother's generosity become a weapon someone else can aim at her? And why did old money make her more valuable dead than alive? Monaco is a country so small it can be crossed in minutes, yet so expensive it can bankrupt a life in a single signature. Its geography is a pressure cooker: limited land, constant global demand, and an economy built on prestige, privacy, and property. In a place like this, old money does not need factories or farms. It needs square meters, rent rolls, and the quiet power of ownership. For decades, the Pastor family was described as Monaco's second dynasty after the Grimaldis, not because they wore crowns, but because their buildings shaped the skyline and their leases shaped the monthly reality of everyone who lived inside it. What does wealth look like when it isn't spent but stored in concrete and collected every month like a tide? It looks like an empire that grows while the owners sleep, and a family structure where inheritance feels less like a future event and more like a permanent atmosphere. That is the hidden trap of dynastic money. It can raise children inside comfort so total that independence stops being a goal and starts feeling like an insult. In ordinary families, adulthood is a break from the parent's wallet. In trust fund families, adulthood can become a lifelong contract: allowances, bailouts, investments, and a gentle sense that consequences belong to other people. And when the allowance is measured in hundreds of thousands of euros, money is no longer help, it becomes identity. How does a son or daughter learn discipline when the world never says no? How does love stay pure when every argument is also a negotiation with the person holding the purse strings? In that ecosystem, the most powerful figure is rarely the flashiest. It is the gatekeeper, the parent or grandparent who controls access, sets conditions, and can tighten the flow of cash with a single decision. That gatekeeper may believe they're protecting their family, but protection can quietly become leverage, and leverage attracts predators. Because Monaco is not only a playground for the ultra-rich, it is also a showroom where status can be faked, credentials can be polished, and proximity to power can be monetized. And when an outsider discovers that one elderly woman stands between dependency and inheritance, the question turns chillingly simple. In a dynasty built on rent and routine, what happens when someone decides the fastest way to earn is to remove the gate itself? The Pastor fortune did not begin as Monaco glamour. It began as immigrant math: how to turn exhausted hands into ownership in a place where every square meter would eventually become gold. In the late 19th century, Giovanni Battista Pastor arrived from Italy with little more than a worker's endurance and a ruthless ability to see value where other people saw inconvenience. Monaco needed builders, and builders who were patient enough to start at the bottom could eventually stand close enough to the palace to hear where the next opportunity would be. He built, saved, and studied the principality like a chessboard: the harbor, the slopes, the coastline, the empty plots most people ignored because they looked like nothing. What happened next was the kind of quiet pivot that creates old money without anyone noticing until it is too late to compete. Contracts led to credibility, credibility led to bigger contracts, and eventually the Pastor name stopped being a signature on paperwork and became a stamp on the city itself. After World War II, as Monaco transformed into a tax-friendly stage for Europe's wealth and secrecy, the family's strategy evolved into something colder and far more powerful than spending. They learned to own and hold. This is the doctrine that makes dynasties: build luxury, keep it, rent it, repeat it, and let time do the compounding. In a microstate with limited land, holding property is like holding oxygen. Demand rises, supply cannot, and the rent becomes a permanent river. That river carried the Pastor family into a position often described as shadow royalty, second only to the ruling Grimaldis. not because they ruled by law, but because they ruled by keys and leases. By the time Hélène Pastor inherited the core of the empire after her father's death in 1990, she was not simply rich, she was embedded in Monaco's daily life, a major landowner whose name sat on buildings, contracts, and the quiet routines of thousands of residents. Reports about her wealth varied, as they always do with private dynasties, but the consistent picture was unmistakable. A woman controlling billions in assets within a few square miles, the kind of concentrated fortune that turns personal decisions into economic weather. Yet Helene's public personality was not always the expected stereotype of a billionaire queen. Stories circulated about eccentric habits that made her seem almost ordinary, choices that looked like humility or privacy, depending on who was telling them. But behind any personal quirk was the real structure. She was a mother, and her mothering was famously generous. She financed, supported, and protected her children at a scale most families cannot even imagine, and this is where the tragedy's foundation hardens. Because generosity is not neutral when it becomes permanent. When adult children receive huge monthly allowances, reportedly in the range of hundreds of thousands of euros, the money does more than pay for a lifestyle, it rewires motivation. Independence stops being necessary, then stops being desirable. Self-discipline becomes optional, consequences become negotiable, and adulthood becomes a continuous extension of childhood, only with better clothes and higher stakes. How does a family stay emotionally honest when financial reality is always one parent's decision away? It doesn't, not easily. Love becomes tangled with dependence, and dependence creates friction that can be exploited. In this system, the most powerful figure is the gatekeeper. Not the spouse, not the boyfriend, not even the child living most extravagantly. The gatekeeper is the person who controls the stream, who can pause it, reduce it, demand explanations, or enforce conditions. Hélène, by staying in control of the purse strings, may have believed she was protecting her children from reckless ruin, and perhaps she was, but gatekeeping also creates resentment, and resentment creates an opening for someone who promises liberation. That opening arrived through her daughter, Sylvia, who had lived long enough to carry her own wounds, relationships, disappointments, a life that did not necessarily give her the internal toughness the Pastor fortune assumed she had. Then, in the mid-1980s, Sylvia met a man who understood exactly how old money can be breached, not by force, but by intimacy. Wojciech Janowski did not appear like a criminal. He appeared like the kind of cosmopolitan somebody Monaco was designed to produce. Polished suits, confident introductions, a resume that sounded like doors opening. Monaco is a place where proximity to prestige can be mistaken for prestige itself, and a talented imposter can survive for years on the social oxygen of titles, committees, charity events, and the appearance of importance. Janowski's alleged brilliance, according to later court narratives, was not building a real empire, but building a believable story long enough to extract money from someone else's. Over time, he embedded himself into the Pastor world not as an intruder, but as family. Years turning into decades, dinners turning into habits, and habits turning into trust. And in old money families, trust is the most valuable asset because it grants access without surveillance. What did he learn at those tables? He learned the family's financial anatomy, who controlled the money, how the allowances flowed, how much Sylvia could spend without questions, and most importantly, who could stop it. The longer he stayed, the clearer the equation became. If Sylvia depended on her mother's approval and Hélène controlled the inheritance timeline, then the true obstacle was not a business competitor or a thief in the street. The obstacle was a 77-year-old woman whose continued existence kept the gate closed. Were the warning signs ignored because love was real, or because the comfort was too addictive to question? And when dependence becomes the family's normal, how does anyone recognize a predator, especially one who has learned to call himself one of them? A dynasty built on property can survive recessions, scandals, and even political shifts, but it is fragile in one specific way. It assumes family loyalty is stronger than money. The Pastor system, massive assets, controlled access, and adult children cushioned by permanent allowances, created a predictable tension. The gatekeeper's power protects the fortune, but it also humiliates the dependents because it quietly reminds them that their freedom is rented. What happened next was the moment that tension became a motive. Over the years, prosecutors would argue that Yanofsky's life was a carefully staged illusion funded almost entirely by Sylvia's resources, polished appearances covering shaky ventures, debts, and a lifestyle that needed constant feeding. In cases like this, the real threat is not one single theft. It is the long, slow normalization of financial extraction. A forged invoice here, a business opportunity there, money moved through accounts and structures designed to make questions feel impolite. In wealthy circles, suspicion is a social crime. Predators understand this. They weaponize etiquette. They make their target feel embarrassed for doubting them. And because Sylvia lived inside a family fortune, the amounts could be enormous without ever triggering the kind of panic that would exist in an ordinary household. But even the biggest river can reveal its shallows when the withdrawals accelerate. By the early 2010s, the pressure reportedly intensified, projects collapsing, creditors circling, and the risk of exposure rising. Then came the trigger that turned greed into something darker: illness. When Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer, the relationship's financial structure changed overnight. A parasite fears one thing more than investigation: the host's disappearance before the gate opens. If Sylvia died while Hélène still controlled the inheritance flow, the allowance system could vanish, the money could tighten, and Yanofsky's entire construction, status, lifestyle, borrowed prestige could collapse in weeks. How does a man who has lived for decades on other people's money face sudden financial gravity? Some people downsize, some confess, some flee. Prosecutors argued that Yanofsky chose the most irreversible option: eliminate the gatekeeper. In this framing, murder became a form of financial planning, a grotesque shortcut to inheritance access. The plan did not require a sophisticated criminal mastermind. It required hiring desperate men and moving money quietly enough to connect intent to action. And here is where the story becomes almost absurd in its contrast: Monaco's wealth and glamour colliding with the messy incompetence of street crime. On the evening of May 6, 2014, Hélène Pastor left a hospital in Nice after visiting her son, who had suffered a serious health condition. She entered a vehicle with her longtime chauffeur, Mohamed Darwish, by many accounts a trusted presence who had driven her for years, more companion than employee. The route should have been routine. The security should have been implied by status alone. But status does not stop a shotgun. An attacker approached, fired through the car window, and chaos exploded in seconds. Hélène was gravely wounded. Darwish was also struck. The vehicle crashed forward, and within minutes, the shadow princess of Monaco's real estate world lay bleeding in a public street, a billionaire reduced to flesh and breath like anyone else. The murder felt like a mafia message at first. Monaco is the kind of place where people expect organized crime narratives to fit, but the investigation moved quickly toward a different explanation: money trails, phone records, travel details, amateur mistakes that left evidence everywhere. In many high-profile assassinations, the killers disappear into professional silence. Here, they left the kind of fingerprints poverty leaves: taxi receipts, hotel stays, digital crumbs. The more investigators polled, the more the story shifted from underworld mythology to something far more intimate: a betrayal that began not in an alley, but at family dinners. Darwish would later die from his injuries, turning the crime into a double tragedy: collateral death from loyalty, a man killed simply because he sat beside the wrong person at the wrong time. Hélène, briefly conscious in the days after, reportedly signaled fear and hinted she had more to say, but the clock outran her. On May 21, 2014, she died, and with her went the one voice that could have described what she suspected in those final moments. What happened next was the unspooling that prosecutors call inevitable: arrests, confessions, and the collapse of the respectable mask. Investigators traced financial movements leading up to the attack, then traced the network of intermediaries, people recruited not for ideology but for cash. A personal trainer, according to court reporting, became a coordinator, connecting the polished world of Monaco to the desperate neighborhoods where hired guns live. And then the name that made the story explode:
followed: Sylvia's partner, the man who had sat at the table for nearly 30 decades. In 2018, a French court convicted Wojciech Janowski of ordering the murder and sentenced him to life in prison, along with heavy sentences for accomplices. The court rejected the romantic excuses that sometimes appear in family crimes, the claim that it was love, protection, or necessity. It was paid for with the family's own money. The verdict didn't just punish a man, it exposed the hidden structure underneath old money, the way dependence can be monetized, the way prestige can camouflage predation, and the way a dynasty can be attacked not by outsiders, but by the person who has learned where the locks are. Has anything really changed, or does the modern world simply offer more elegant disguises for the same ancient hunger?
The Hélène Pastor tragedy is dressed in Monaco luxury, harbor lights, designer suits, silent lobbies, but its engine is familiar in any century. Dependency creates leverage, and leverage attracts predators. In the modern world, this pattern appears far beyond old money dynasties. It shows up in influencer families, where support becomes control, in celebrity households, where assistants and partners manage money while the star becomes emotionally exhausted, and in trust fund environments where adulthood is postponed indefinitely because comfort makes urgency feel unnecessary. What does a person become when the world never forces them to stand on their own? Sometimes they become harmless and soft. Sometimes they become entitled. And sometimes the worst possibility emerges. Someone else steps in and monetizes the softness. The Pastor case also reflects a modern phenomenon of credential theater, how status can be fabricated through titles, charities, committees, and consulting brands that exist mainly as social proof. Monaco, like many elite ecosystems, is vulnerable to this because prestige travels faster than verification. A polished resume can function like a passport, and once inside, the fraud can feed for years without triggering alarms because suspicion is considered impolite. This creates a dangerous modern parallel. In a world of curated identities and verified optics, the most convincing predator is the one who looks legitimate enough to never be questioned. The consequences of that dynamic are not only financial, they are psychological. When a family discovers they have been deceived from within, trust collapses like glass. Every memory becomes contaminated. Every holiday, every dinner, every warm photograph now carries the shadow of calculation. That is one of the cruelest forms of violence in inheritance crimes. The victim's life is not just ended, it is reinterpreted. Hélène Pastor's death did not merely remove a person, it fractured a dynasty's internal meaning. The family's name still sits on buildings, rents still flow, Monaco's skyline still stands, but the idea of family becomes unstable when betrayal was seated at the table for 28 years. There is also a wider social consequence. This case reminds the public that old money can rot without any outside enemy. People often imagine dynasties fall because of recessions, scandal, or competitors. But here, the alleged destroyer was not a rival developer or a mafia boss. It was an intimate partner exploiting a family's weakest design choice: permanent adult dependency. The story also highlights the cost of untreated power dynamics between parent and adult child. If the parent uses money to control, the child may use relationships to escape. If the child becomes dependent, the partner can become the interpreter of that dependence, turning private resentment into a narrative of rescue, then into a narrative of justification. So what does this pattern look like today? It looks like money replacing boundaries, like help replacing responsibility, and like love becoming indistinguishable from access. And when access becomes the real romance, the final betrayal is not surprising. It is simply the last logical step.
The uncomfortable lesson of Hélène Pastor is that generosity without structure can become a trap for everyone involved. Supporting children is not the danger. The danger is replacing adulthood with permanent allowance, creating a life where consequences never arrive and therefore responsibility never forms. The first solution is counterintuitive for old money. Design independence on purpose. Trusts and family offices can fund education, housing, and health while still requiring accountability, milestones, audits, and transparent reporting that normalizes questions instead of treating them as insults. What happens when a family makes financial oversight rude? Predators thrive. The second lesson is relational. Money must not be the only language a parent uses with adult children. When love is expressed mainly as payment, love becomes measurable, and resentment becomes negotiable. Healthy boundaries sound cold, but they protect warmth. The third lesson is cultural. Prestige is not proof. Titles, charity boards, honorary roles, and glamorous biographies can be manufactured. In elite ecosystems, verification is a form of self-defense. A family that verifies quietly is not paranoid, it is responsible. The fourth lesson is about coercive control disguised as romance. The most dangerous partner is not always the violent one. Sometimes it is the one who speaks softly, isolates slowly, and frames the gatekeeper as an enemy until freedom becomes a story that justifies theft than harm. Finally, the lesson for the audience is broader than Monaco. Wealth does not remove human risk, it concentrates it. The bigger the fortune, the more it can distort relationships, delay maturity, and attract people who treat intimacy as an investment. Old money can build towers that outlive generations, but only ethics and boundaries can protect the family living inside those towers.
Hélène Pastor's life was built on a dynasty that turned stone and coastline into permanent power. 3 generations learned the same doctrine: own the land, hold the buildings, collect the rent, and let time multiply the fortune. But her death revealed a different doctrine, one the rich rarely admit. The greatest threat to old money is not always the outside world. Sometimes it is the quiet dependency cultivated inside the family, and the stranger who learns to weaponize it. A woman could be powerful enough to shape Monaco's skyline, yet still vulnerable to the most intimate kind of betrayal. The person who sat beside her for decades, smiling through dinners while calculating the day her existence would become an obstacle. What does it say about a dynasty when love and money become impossible to separate? It says the inheritance has already begun to poison the room. The Pastor empire still stands and the rents still flow, but a family can outlive its own trust. That is the true cost. Not only a life taken, but a legacy fractured. Every memory rewritten, every relationship questioned, every act of generosity reinterpreted as leverage. Old money can buy privacy, security, and silence, but it cannot buy certainty about the people closest to you. Now it's your turn. Before this story, had you ever heard of Hélène Pastor? Do you believe extreme parental support creates safety, or does it create dependency that invites predators? Leave your opinion in the comments, share this episode with someone who thinks wealth guarantees protection, and subscribe for more documentaries where power, family, and morality collide behind the most beautiful gates.